The city of Fardus was silent that evening, bathed in the cold glow of distant stars and the flickering lights of 1,000 neon signs. Caden leaned against the weathered stone of an alleyway, the hum of the bustling metropolis muffled by the towering skyscrapers surrounding him. He adjusted the strap of his pack, scanning the street ahead. It was the same routine every night, hiding, waiting, surviving. But tonight was different. Tonight, something pulled him into the heart of this city's dangerous rumors. Rumors of her. Lyra. A woman, or perhaps more than a woman, who stood at the center of every whispered tale in Fardus. They said she could kill with a touch. They said her skin was like liquid metal, shimmering in the shadows, and her eyes held the depth of 1,000 years. But it was the rumors of death that haunted Caden. For every man, every woman who dared touch her, they turned to dust. Gone in an instant. And yet, there was something about her that had captivated him. Not the stories of destruction. Not the fear that gripped the city at the mention of her name. No. It was the stillness in the chaos, the lonely power that radiated from her as she stood unmoving in the plaza. No one dared approach, but Caden, he wasn't like the others. He had nothing left to lose. His fingers itched with the desire to discover the truth. As the night deepened, the sounds of the city became a distant hum. Caden's boots scraped against the cracked pavement as he moved toward the plaza. He could see her silhouette now, standing in the center of the fountain, her long hair swaying in the breeze like strands of silver. The crowd was thin tonight, as always, no one daring to approach, yet all eyes were drawn to her, as if entranced by an invisible force. Caden took a breath, the air thick with the scent of rain and metal, and made his way through the crowd. His heart beat a little faster with every step. He could feel the electric tension in the air, thick like the static before a storm. This wasn't the fear of the unknown, it was something more primal. Something that stirred deep inside him, a pull he couldn't quite understand. He stopped a few paces away from her. The stories, the warnings, all ran through his mind, but he didn't care. All his life, he'd been a soldier, trained to fight, trained to survive. A curse, a legend, a threat. It didn't matter. The truth was what he was after. And if it meant getting close to the one person in the galaxy who seemed untouchable, then so be it. Lyra turned, her violet eyes locking onto his, and Caden felt a shiver run down his spine. Her gaze was like a force of nature, silent, heavy, and impossibly ancient. For a moment, neither of them moved. He felt his pulse thundering in his ears, his every instinct screaming at him to back away, but he stood his ground. "You don't belong here, human," she said, her voice soft yet commanding, like the whisper of the wind through dead leaves. Caden's lips curled into a small, confident smile. "Neither do you," he replied, his voice steady despite the weight of her presence. "But here we both are." She tilted her head, a strange flicker in her gaze. "You think I won't kill you? I think you haven't yet." He stepped closer, the air thickening as he crossed the invisible line. Her eyes didn't leave him, and the crowd around them held its breath. Caden stopped just within arm's reach, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. There was an intensity to the moment, like the very fabric of reality was waiting for something, anything, to shift. But Lyra didn't move. She didn't act. Instead, she studied him, her eyes narrowing as if searching for something. "Why?" she asked. "Why come here? Why now?" "Because I'm tired of running from things that don't make sense." Caden's voice softened, the hardness of his tone fading. He wasn't just speaking to her. He was speaking to himself. "I've spent my whole life fighting, killing, surviving. But none of that means anything if you don't understand the why behind it." Lyra's lips parted slightly, as if contemplating his words. Her posture remained unchanged, yet there was a subtle shift in the air around them, a current that seemed to pull them closer, a tension that filled the space between them. "I'm not what you think I am," she said, her voice quieter now, almost as if she were confiding in him. "I am not a weapon. I was made to be something else. But the galaxy has no use for me. No use for the truth. It's easier to destroy what you don't understand." Caden's heart skipped a beat. There was something raw in her voice, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. She wasn't just a killer. She wasn't just the embodiment of fear. She was more. And in that moment, he realized how little he truly understood about her. His hand, unbidden, reached out toward her. The crowd gasped, but Caden didn't hear them. His focus was entirely on her. His fingers hovered just inches from her skin, the invisible barrier between them humming with unspoken power. "I can touch you, can I?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "I can touch you, without dying." Lyra didn't answer immediately. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. The tension was palpable, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment to shatter. Finally, she spoke. "You don't know what you're asking." "I do," Caden said, his fingers trembling. "I'm not afraid of you." And then, for the first time in his life, Caden reached out to touch her. The moment his hand made contact, a shockwave of energy burst through the plaza. The crowd screamed, scattering in every direction. But Caden didn't feel fear. He felt something else, something indescribable, something that tore through his chest, leaving him raw and exposed. The power in her touch was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. In that instant, Caden realized he had touched the forbidden, and it had changed everything. But was it for better, or for worse? The rain had started, quiet at first, just a light mist that clung to the air, but now it was relentless, drumming against the stone beneath their feet. Caden stood motionless, his hands still tingling from the touch. The energy that had surged through him was still there, a constant hum beneath his skin. He looked at Lyra, her form now shrouded in the dim glow of the city lights, her face unreadable. The plaza around them had emptied quickly, the crowd scattering as if the storm had caught them off guard. But Caden wasn't afraid of the storm. He had never been afraid of anything. Yet, in this moment, as the rain fell in sheets around them, he felt a deeper unease, something gnawing at the edges of his mind. "I told you it wasn't what you think," Lyra said softly, her voice breaking through the steady beat of the rain. "You've just made things much harder for both of us." Caden wasn't sure what he expected, maybe fear, maybe anger, but her words didn't sound like either. They felt like warning. He couldn't help but wonder if she was talking about herself, or about him. Maybe both. "Harder how?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm of questions swirling in his mind. "What happens now?" Lyra turned away from him, her gaze fixed on the rain as it fell in heavy sheets, blurring the city's outlines. "You don't understand what you've just done. I've lived my entire life with this power, this curse. People fear me, want me, and destroy themselves trying to control me." She paused, her voice thick with a pain Caden hadn't expected. It wasn't the cold detachment he'd come to expect from her, but something far more raw, more human. "I didn't ask for this," she continued. "No one did." Caden took a step closer to her, the distance between them still charged, like the very air wanted to pull them together and tear them apart at the same time. "And yet here we are. I don't know why, but I can't walk away from this." "From you?" Lyra's head snapped back toward him, her eyes flashing with something he couldn't quite place. "You're a fool," she spat, her voice sharper now, the venom returning. "You think I want this? Want you here? I am not some prize to be won, some game to be played. If you think you can save me, you're wrong." Caden wasn't deterred. He didn't come this far to let her words scare him off. He stepped forward again, his eyes locked onto hers. "I'm not trying to save you. I'm trying to understand you. I'm trying to see the person behind all the fear." For a moment, Lyra said nothing, her chest rising and falling with a breath that seemed to weigh 1,000 tons. Then, her lips parted slightly, and her voice was barely a whisper. "You can't touch me without consequences. You can't just pretend everything will be fine, Caden. I am not like you." The way she said his name, the way it hung in the air, stirred something deep inside him. A feeling he hadn't expected, a connection, fragile and fleeting, but real. He wasn't afraid anymore. Not of her, not of the power that emanated from her, not of the consequences. I know, he said softly, his voice earnest. But maybe that's what makes us the same. Maybe that's why I'm still here. We're both trapped by what we are. She met his gaze, her eyes narrowing as if trying to decipher him. You have no idea what it means to be trapped. The words were cutting, but they weren't just aimed at him. She was speaking of something deeper, something ancient. The air around them thickened, and Caden could feel the change before it came. He could see it in the tension of her body, the way her hands clenched by her sides, the sharpness in her breath. He didn't know if it was the rain or her power, but it felt like the world was about to fracture. I know more than you think, Caden replied, his voice growing more certain with each word. I've spent my life trapped, Lyra. And I'm tired of it. I'm tired of running. Maybe we both need something different. The air crackled between them, and for the first time, Caden noticed the slight tremor in Lyra's hands, the way her shoulders seemed to tense with the weight of some unspoken force. Before he could move, before he could speak again, Lyra turned sharply and began walking toward the edge of the plaza, the rain streaking down her face like tears she refused to shed. Caden followed without hesitation, his heart racing as he closed the distance between them. Where are you going? He asked, his voice a mixture of urgency and confusion. To show you what you don't understand, she said without turning around, her words carrying the weight of something final, something inevitable. They reached the edge of the plaza, where a massive structure loomed, a relic from an ancient time, a place that even the most daring citizens of Fardis avoided. Lyra stopped in front of it, her body rigid with tension. This is where it all began, she said, her voice low, almost reverent. This is where my people fell. Caden stood beside her, looking at the ruins with a sense of foreboding. It was a place of broken stone, long abandoned by time, yet still hauntingly present in its silence. The story of my people is older than you can imagine, she continued, her voice soft yet filled with sorrow. We were gods once, or so they thought. But in the end, they made us into monsters. My curse is a reminder of that. The words hung in the air between them, thick with the weight of history, of loss. Caden wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but he knew it wasn't that simple. Lyra's eyes darkened as she turned to face him. You wanted to understand me? Now you do. This is what I am. This is what I've been carrying my entire life. Caden stood there, the rain cascading down around them, the tension between them palpable. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but in that moment, something inside him shifted. Whatever this was, whatever they were, it wasn't just about understanding. It was about survival. And there was no going back. The world around them was shifting. Caden could feel it, like the air had become denser, charged with an energy he couldn't fully comprehend. The storm had passed, leaving only the heavy scent of wet earth and the sound of distant thunder. But the world around him felt too still, too quiet, like a moment before something terrible happened. Lyra was staring at the ruins of the ancient temple, her expression unreadable. Her shoulders were rigid, as if bracing for something, or perhaps trying to hold something back. Caden stood beside her, uncertain of how to proceed. He had seen many things in his life, death, violence, betrayal, but nothing quite like this. Nothing that felt so personal. You said this is where it all began, Caden said, his voice steady but edged with curiosity. What happened here? Lyra didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, her gaze distant, as if the answer was somewhere buried in the crumbling stones before them. Caden could almost see the weight of the history pressing down on her, as if the place itself was alive with memories, memories that had scarred her, bound her. This place, it's where my people were betrayed, she said, her voice so soft he almost missed it. They thought they could control us. They thought we were gods. But in the end, we were nothing more than weapons to them. Caden's mind raced. He'd heard the stories, of course, the ones that spoke of Lyra's people as gods, as beings with unimaginable power. But he hadn't realized the depth of the tragedy. To be revered and then discarded, to be worshipped and feared all in one motion. It was a cruelty that no one should have to endure. And what happened to your people? Caden asked, his voice softer now, more sympathetic than before. Are you the last? She nodded, her face falling into shadows. I am. And I've been running ever since. Her words struck him harder than he expected. She wasn't just a weapon, a force of nature. She was a person, scarred by the weight of a history she couldn't escape. And now, here they were, standing at the epicenter of that history, caught in the pull of something neither of them could control. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, suffocating, as if the ruins themselves were holding their breath. Then, without warning, Lyra turned to him, her violet eyes sharp and piercing. You don't understand what it's like, she said, her voice tight with emotion. You can't. No one can. I've spent my whole life running, hiding. And now you've crossed a line you can never uncross. Caden felt his pulse quicken, but he stood his ground. Maybe I don't understand. But I'm trying to. I'm trying to understand you. Her eyes narrowed. And what will you do with that understanding? You can't save me, Caden. You can't change what I am. I'm not trying to save you, he said, his voice steady but firm. I'm trying to stand beside you. I'm trying to be a part of whatever happens next. For a long time, Lyra didn't answer. Her lips parted as if to say something, but the words seemed to get stuck, caught in the tension between them. Caden could see the conflict in her eyes, the fear, the hesitation, the longing, and something shifted inside him. He knew she was pushing him away, but he wasn't going to give up. Not now. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crack split the air, a sound like thunder, but sharper, more violent. The ground beneath them trembled, and Caden stumbled back, instinctively reaching for Lyra's arm to steady himself. But she was already moving, her hand outstretched, a strange energy crackling at her fingertips. Her face was hard now, focused, as if the world around them had shifted into something far more dangerous. We're not alone, she said, her voice low and tense. Get back! Before Caden could react, a shadow moved across the ruins, followed by a low hum that vibrated through the ground. From the darkness, a figure emerged, a tall, imposing silhouette, its movements precise and calculated. It was armored, its face obscured by a dark helmet, but Caden could feel the weight of its presence. This wasn't just any enemy. This was someone, or something, prepared for what they had just unleashed. The figure paused, its gaze flicking between Caden and Lyra. There was no surprise, no hesitation, only cold, unwavering purpose. And in that moment, Caden realized exactly who, and what, they were dealing with. They found us, Lyra whispered, her voice tight with a mix of fear and anger. I knew they would. Caden didn't need to ask who they were. He could see the way Lyra's shoulders tensed, the way her fists clenched at her sides. This was no ordinary threat. This was something much bigger, something she had been running from her entire life. The figure took a step forward, and Caden instinctively moved to stand between Lyra and the approaching threat. His mind was racing. He wasn't sure of who or what was coming for them, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. The armored figure spoke, its voice muffled by the helmet, but the words were clear enough. You've been marked, it said, its tone icy and dispassionate. You cannot escape this. Lyra's eyes flicked to Caden, and for the first time since they'd met, he saw a flicker of something. Vulnerability, maybe? Fear? She was as trapped as he had suspected. The weight of her past was catching up to her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Caden turned to face the armored figure, his jaw clenched. You're too late. I'm not going anywhere without her. The figure's response was simple, almost chilling. You'll die for her, then. Lyra's eyes met Caden's, and in that instant, everything changed. There was no more running. No more hiding. This was the moment where the past, the curse, the threat, everything collided. And no matter what happened next, they were in this together. The air crackled, charged with the overwhelming hum of energy. Caden's heart thundered in his chest as the blinding light from Lyra's hand cut through the darkness. His vision blurred, but he didn't need to see. He could feel it, the raw power coursing through her, the force of her defiance. It was like standing in the center of a storm, and in that moment, Caden knew that everything was about to change. The armored figure staggered back, raising its hands instinctively to shield itself from the surge of energy. But the blast wasn't meant to destroy. It was meant to warn. A warning that Lyra was no longer just a weapon to be controlled. She was a force of nature, and so was he now. He had chosen to stand beside her. Lyra stood tall, her chest rising and falling with the effort, her hands still outstretched. Her eyes glowed with the same violet intensity that had haunted Caden from the moment they met. But now, there was something else in them, a flicker of resolve. It was a look that spoke volumes. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting. The armored figure grunted, clearly stunned but not defeated. It slowly straightened, the sound of its joints shifting as it recalibrated its stance. Caden knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Whatever this figure was, it had the power to push them both to the brink. "You've made a mistake," the figure said, its voice distorted by the helmet. It was cold, clinical, devoid of any emotion. "You cannot escape the mandate." Lyra's lips curled into a bitter smile. "I never intended to escape," she replied, her voice low but fierce. "I just wanted to live on my own terms. But if you think you can take me, then come and try." Caden didn't move, but his muscles were taut, ready. He wasn't sure what kind of fight was coming, but he wasn't going to let Lyra face it alone. His body was still tingling from the energy surge, but his mind was clear, focused. They had crossed a line tonight. There was no turning back. The figure tilted its head slightly, as though analyzing them, calculating the odds. It took a step forward, its movements precise and deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. Lyra wasn't having it. She took a step forward as well, her feet sure and steady on the ground, the air around her shimmering with barely contained power. "Stop," Caden said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He stepped in front of Lyra, placing a hand on her arm, his touch firm. She flinched but didn't pull away. "Caden," she murmured, her voice laced with frustration. "This isn't your fight." "It is now," he replied, his gaze locked on the armored figure. "And I'm not backing down." Lyra's eyes softened for a brief moment, a flicker of something between them. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. The armored figure didn't wait for them to continue their exchange. It raised its weapon, a sleek, black energy rifle, and aimed directly at Caden. Caden's breath caught, but he didn't flinch. He knew what was coming. Then, in an instant, Lyra moved. With a speed that seemed almost inhuman, she stepped between Caden and the figure, her arm raised. The energy in her body surged again, a flash of violet light streaking toward the weapon. The rifle exploded in a burst of sparks and energy, and the figure stumbled back, its weapon useless. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The figure stood there, silent and still, its stance unwavering despite the loss of its weapon. And then, with a sound like grinding metal, the helmet slid open, revealing the face beneath. Caden's breath caught in his throat. It was a woman, young, her face pale and angular, her eyes cold as stone. She looked human, but there was something unsettling about her, something artificial about the way she moved. She wasn't just a soldier. She was something else, something engineered, something designed to hunt. Her gaze flicked from Lyra to Caden, and for the briefest moment, something almost human, flashed in her eyes. "You don't understand," the woman said, her voice soft yet unyielding. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. There is no escape for you." Lyra took a step forward, her expression hardening once more. "Escape isn't the point. It never was." Caden felt the weight of her words. There was no escape. Not from the past, not from the enemies closing in. This was their reality now. This was what they had chosen. The woman's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You're wrong," she said, her voice taking on an eerie calmness. "There is always an escape. You just have to be willing to pay the price." With a sudden movement, she raised her hand, and a pulse of energy shot from her fingers, aimed directly at Lyra. Caden's body moved before his mind could catch up. He threw himself in front of her, the blast hitting him square in the chest. The force of it sent him flying backward, crashing to the ground. Lyra screamed his name, her voice raw with panic. She moved to him in an instant, her hands hovering over his body as if afraid to touch him. The world seemed to blur around them as Caden struggled to push himself up. His chest burned, a searing pain radiating from the spot where the energy had hit. But it wasn't enough to stop him. It wasn't enough to keep him down. "I'm not leaving you," he rasped, his voice hoarse. His hand reached out, grabbing hers as she knelt beside him. The contact was electric, sending a wave of warmth through his body. He could feel the power in her, could feel it surging, pushing against the limits of what he thought was possible. She hesitated, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Then we fight," she said, her voice strong, resolute. "Together." Caden nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. They had reached the edge, the point of no return. But there was no fear. Not anymore. They were in this together, no matter what the cost. The armored woman's figure loomed over them, her expression unreadable. Then, she spoke again. "You're already dead," she said, her voice colder than ever. "But if you want to fight, then fight."